Pilar Gerasimo.
And I'm Dallas Hartwig.
And we're starting this podcast. And we thought it would be fun to start the podcast with how we started and our origin story. All the way back.
Yeah.
So bring me back, all the way back into the history of Dallas Hartwig. Where did you come from, my friend?
Well, I was born in Eastern Ontario, in Canada, and my parents were pretty earthy folk. I'll almost go so far as to say they were homesteaders. They were kind of, the early 70s hippies, and they lived on 100 acres. And prior to my birth, I'm the oldest, so prior to my birth, they lived kind of in a place that was basically a barn. That was they were in there for the summer while fixing up what was originally an old cabin, essentially an old homestead. There was a teeny tiny little, log cabin. And they fixed that up and put a new roof on it and made it actually livable. And that's where I lived for, from birth on. But we had no running water. We had no electricity.
Wow.
We lived like homesteaded. We had a huge, vegetable garden. We had an outhouse. We heated with wood that we cut off of the 100 acres of, the property. And that was what we did. And
so outhouse, outside.
Had to in the middle of winter go outside, in the cold. And in Eastern Ontario, it gets cold and windy. And snowy a lot in the winter. So I don't remember. I mean, I would live there till I was 5, so I don't have a ton of memories of the outhouse specifically.
Thank God.
Yeah, right. All the traumas.
Yeah.
But yeah, we had a very sort of natural rhythm to our life, to our day, even where when it got dark, you lit oil lamps. We had 2 or 3 around the house, and we did have one. Our luxury was we had one light bulb over the dining room table. It was
Civil War era.
It was wired to a 12-volt car battery.
Seriously,
so it was we had a little bit of electric light in that
one light bulb.
One light bulb. But yeah, so we lived a very natural rhythm, and I think that actually was a good trajectory for my life in terms of, being in touch with those natural rhythms of seasons, of, day and night, of, what happens when the sun goes down. Well, you sort of naturally wind down. That's sort of what you do. And I've always likened it to one step up from camping, because that's what happens when you go camping. Is the same. At the end of the day, when you're, sitting around the campfire, you're pretty chill. There's not really a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty relaxed way of being. And when the sun comes up, you're kind of waking up because it's shining right in your eyes.
That's a rare upbringing, though.
No, I'm totally an anomaly. Absolutely.
Not as much as you might think, actually.
Well, right. Okay.
So this is your world up until what age?
5.
5 years old. And then what happens?
Well, my parents realized that I should go to school.
Oh, it occurred to them.
Right,
we should educate our son.
We were at the end of a dead-end road, way outside a tiny town, way outside a medium-sized town. And so it was just too far to go on a daily basis for school. So my parents made the change, sold that property, moved to a place that was still rural outside of a medium-sized town in Eastern Ontario. And, I started going to a relatively conventional schooling system. It was private school, but, kind of small. It was actually, for the first couple of years, it was kind of almost like a one-room schoolhouse. So unconventional in that sense, but conventional, daytime schooling. And kind of went through a relatively normal process with school from there on out.
What were you interested in school?
I cared about biology, which wasn't biology in, grade 2, but, it was
cute though.
Plants and animals and how stuff worked. And I was super duper nerdy kid. I read encyclopedias, and I like to learn. I like to read. I was social, but I also was totally fine. Just give me a book and I'm good for a while. So that was kind of always it was time out never was a punishment that worked for me, because I was
I'll sit here with my book.
Fine. Oh well, I'll talk to you tomorrow. No big deal.
Were you an athletic kid?
Not at all. I was an active kid. I was definitely not an athletic kid in the organized sports way. Probably because my parents didn't really push or even necessarily value that, and probably because I just wasn't coordinated enough to be good at anything.
It's hard to get a team on too when you're 5 years old, living in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, totally. And I didn't really even have that much interest in that.
Yeah.
I like to do stuff outside. I like to ride my bike. I like to kind of just be generally active. But through high school, I didn't do much of anything sort of organized sports. I did play volleyball in high school, but that was kind of the extent of my organized sports history. But yeah, I was always we did a lot of stuff as a family, a lot of active stuff. We were backpacking and mountain biking and
super outdoors.
Yeah, my dad loved to build cedar canvas canoes, so he custom built canoes, and we would take canoe trips and that kind of stuff. So, but definitely outdoorsy in that sense, but not in a competitive sense where we didn't do any mountain bike racing. We just did stuff for fun as a family.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a really
nice.
It was a really great childhood, and one that I'm hoping to kind of move towards as I bring my son up into kind of getting back towards more of that kind of a a slower pace and more time as a family and more time in the outdoors, which I do now somewhat, but I'm trying to like really move towards that.
Yeah, the more you get, the more hunger you have for it.
Well, and I remember how good it was of a childhood. Like I remember like how like the experiences we had as a family were so just deep and meaningful and powerful and slow and quiet and like easy. Like that's the kind of stuff that I want to offer, that I personally want to live more of myself, but I also want to offer to my son as he gets older.
It's interesting. So, it sounds like in some ways your early upbringing had an influence on your appreciation now as a kind of primal paleo ancestral lifestyles advocate.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Strong influence for sure.
But let's go back because I want to get to college.
Yeah.
So what did you study in school?
In college, I did anatomy and physiology.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
I had the idea that I would be a physical therapist going into college. Just sort of like, well, I'll do pre-physical therapy and kind of use it as a track.
Why? Why that? What made you?
Well, so what I realized, I said I wasn't an antisocial child, but I became more social through high school and heading into college, and realized that I really enjoyed helping people. But I also really enjoyed the like how things work, problem solving, science side of things. So PT was a nice like. Every new patient that comes in is a new set of problems, is a new problem-solving challenge. But also I get to work with people one-on-one and actually like get to know them and like impact their lives directly, versus being sort of like on the research side or some larger kind of system side. I got people and science and problem-solving all in one neat little package.
I
got to do it 10 or more times a day.
Wow, that's cool.
So that was sort of my idea. And actually, fortunately, going into college, I had that sort of premise, or had the sort of best guess, because I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do, and ended up working out really, really well. I practiced PT then I went to grad school, got my master's in physical therapy, and then practiced PT for almost 10 years.
This is all in Canada?
So I came to the States for school and end up getting married and staying down here. Lived in Michigan, Ohio, and Maine for the course of my physical therapy career, and then was like, I'm too far east, I need to get back west. So then I ended up out here in Salt Lake City.
But how long have you been here?
5 years.
Wow.
Totally love it here. It's really awesome here. Because the thing with that here is like it's a reasonably slow pace of life. The like west-ish, like the mountains feel familiar to me. And the people in the mountains feel familiar to me. Like very much resonates with like the kind of folks who hang out in the mountains in BC.
It feels familiar in some
totally.
way.
Yeah, and like in the you look outside and you see this like gigantic mountain range that's like right there. It's super, super awesome and beautiful. And I can get up and go hiking or mountain biking or I can, go snowboarding in 45 minutes door to door. It's like, it's pretty hard to beat that proximity.
It's very difficult to beat it. Now, I want to back up a tiny bit because we somehow got you out of college and then got you to Salt Lake City, but there's a big chapter in the middle there. You've done a few things.
There's a few things in the middle. Since you were a
physical therapist.
Yeah, there's a few things there.
Catch me up. So let's take us through that. We're doing the story, but we're going to be a little bit out of order. I'm going to go back.
Sure.
You get out of school, you become a physical therapist, you do that for a while, and you are now getting more and more interested in health, I presume, and the health of the whole person.
Yeah.
Talk to me about what happens then.
Well, so actually, I'll go back one step back and say my health and sort of taking care of your body was always a really important idea for my parents. So, I grew up vegetarian because that was kind of their perspective, was that was the healthiest way for humans to eat. And so they were like, in order to facilitate health, we're going to be vegetarians as a family. And so that, that was kind of one angle. We were always kind of very, active and outdoorsy. And we're like, my parents didn't smoke or drink. Like they always valued just being healthy as a way of living. And so then going through my early 20s and kind of mid 20s while I'm practicing PT, I always kind of carried that set of values with me where, healthy eating and being active and all that kind of stuff, like it just mattered to me. It was important. It made my life better. And
your body was a temple, that kind of thing?
Yeah, really. And that's actually from my parents, that literally was their perspective. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, so kind of a very like conservative Christian background. And your body's the temple is literally like the whole idea behind my parents' set of values around health. So that's exactly the idea. That, their perspective was, God gave you this body, he created it for you, and like you should take care of it as part of that sort of respect. Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think I don't have that same religious perspective now, but I very much carry that same idea forward of respect for the body that you've been given. And what I found is that sort of, not surprisingly, I suppose, but it makes my life a whole lot better when I do that.
Yeah.
And so that, learning and paying attention to that through my early to mid 20s is what kind of got me on the board of like, I'm just going to keep doing this kind of forever because, there's through college and through my early 20s, I was somewhat less healthy, just paid less attention to it directly. And never really had any sort of medical problems, but just kind of was like less attentive to that. And then sort of was like, I'd like to kind of get back on track. And then kind of it's been relatively easy since then because making consistently good choices makes my life just better.
Yeah.
So
but you probably got better at it too. I'm guessing that being a student of the body and of health. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of, again, like I never quit learning after I left college. Mm-hmm. And so what actually brought me into the study of nutrition specifically, which is kind of what I've done a bunch of over the past few years. My younger sister has rheumatoid arthritis and was diagnosed, I think, at 13. And so it's always kind of been one of those like, oh, I got this kind of weird autoimmune thing in my family, but, was managed with medication and just sort of, I didn't pay super close attention to it, but did pay attention to kind of new drugs, new treatment modalities from a physical therapy angle, just because I could pass them along to somebody I cared about. And happened to be reading some scientific research, in the nerdy research papers that I read, that ended up leading me to look at dietary influences as a really primary driver of chronic inflammation, sort of this idea of systemic inflammation and like driver of chronic disease, including autoimmunity, like rheumatoid arthritis.
Interesting.
So prior to that point, this would have been 2006, I believe. It had never really occurred to me that food could do that. Which sounds ridiculous, right? Like, what do you mean you've never thought? Like, I really hadn't
at that time. It wasn't.
No, I hadn't thought about food as a direct connection between inflammatory process in the body and thus sort of chronic disease. And I hadn't connected those dots. Wow. So in connecting those dots, just with this one paper, I was like, I should learn more about this. And actually, I was playing high-level recreation, or I say competitive volleyball at that point, and had a shoulder thing. My left shoulder was like not happy.
Did you injure it?
Apparently, because it was, it was injured somehow. I didn't have an acute injury, but it wasn't working right. And no one can seem to figure out why. And I saw orthopedist and I had an MRI and we did contrast, injections and I did prednisone and I had cortisone shots. And like I did all the conventional medical stuff, including being a physical therapist myself and, having friends that were like, hey, here's how you should manage this. And it didn't get better, period. And that happened to kind of coincide, that would have been 2005, happened to kind of coincide with my emerging frustration in being a physical therapist, where I had mixed results with making patients better. And some things got a lot better. Some things just were stubborn, and I didn't really understand why they didn't get better, because by the book and by all the things that I was supposed to,
it should get better.
And I became one of the things that should have gotten better and didn't. And so I had this kind of frustration. My shoulder pain was well over a year. No one could really, it was like limiting my playing. It wasn't comfortable to sleep. Like it was actually a major thing. And I read this paper that connected systemic inflammation, autoimmune disease, and dietary factors. And I was like, oh, hey, maybe I should think about that myself. And made a couple really small dietary tweaks, and 6 weeks later, my shoulder pain was gone.
6 weeks?
6 weeks.
What were the dietary changes?
Well, so actually, I didn't really know what I was doing at that point, so it wasn't a really well-crafted program. But
tinkering.
Yeah, it really was, based on really limited information.
Yeah.
The paper I read was talking about inflammatory proteins in legumes. And growing up vegetarian, still retaining a lot of that sort of conventional healthy eating, a lot of whole grains, a lot of legumes, like that kind of thing. I was still doing a lot of that. And I wasn't a vegetarian, but I was still incorporating a lot into my diet on a regular basis. And so I was like, well, maybe if legumes are problematic for people with autoimmune disease, I've got an inflammatory condition, maybe there's some overlap there, I'll just not do that for a while. And it was
6 weeks later.
And 6 weeks later, like it was pain-free and fine and normal, and has been, knock on wood, ever since. And so that got my attention. I was like, I really need to pay attention to this factor, because in 6 weeks with a relatively small dietary change, I resolved something that you hadn't been able to for a year plus, and all the conventional medical treatments hadn't been able to either. So
did you also share this with your sister at that point?
I did. How did you? I did, and like most family members do who are loving and supportive, they say, that's very nice, thank you. And then it falls on deaf ears and nothing happens, right?
Yeah.
I did this for my mother as well, and it took a long time. It took actually somebody else writing a really great book that I could pass along that said the same thing.
They're like, honey, have you read this book?
No, totally. It's exactly what happened. But yeah, so my interest in nutrition kind of really like blossomed at that point, where I said like, oh yeah, I should pay attention to this stuff. And being the nerd, I was like, I'll just read all the research there is, and just read a lot of research and a handful of books, but really most of my work at that point was just reading primary research.
And what were the big insights that you came away from, like holistically, from all of that?
Certainly from a nutritional standpoint, really that food is so much more than calories, so much more than macronutrients of protein, fat, and carbohydrate. It matters so much more other than just, because at that point, coming from a medical background, it basically was, if your body weight is in a healthy range and your blood pressure is fine and your total cholesterol is fine, then you're fine.
You're good.
And really, I was like, oh, wait, no, that's actually not the case.
Yeah.
And so food really became this much more interesting and complex problem to solve for me when I started to realize how much it influenced all these other pieces of your world. Aside from just not making you sick, it also determined how well it made you.
Well, I can see there's the foundations here for what came next, which I presume was your foray into the world of the Whole30, which a lot of people know your work best through that gateway, shall we say. How did that happen? How did it come about?
Well, yeah. So going from being like the science, nutrition, research kind of thing, I started to talk to people about it, and my former business partner and I started doing some public speaking about that. And it started out with like a 2-hour sit down, casual conversation. I hated public speaking. We just talked. And then it became 2 hours, and then it became 4 hours, and then it became full day, and then it became 100 plus seminars in 30 something states and half a dozen countries. So it just like took off like wildfire because people found that the message was so powerful in their lives. They just told everyone else. And then we got tons and tons of inquiries about how do you do this thing? How's this work? Yeah. In 2009, we sort of experimented with a 30-day dietary intervention. And at the time, we was just like the two of us, just trying stuff. And it basically was a paleo-ish, sort of dietary elimination reintroduction program based on Rob Wolf's suggestion, like, hey, try this for 30 days. And we did, and awesome stuff happened. And we wrote it up on the website, and then people jumped on board, by the dozens and hundreds there, and then it became thousands, and then it became this thing. It just like took off.
Yeah.
And so then we called the Whole30, which then we continued to do seminars. We continued to write about on the Whole 9 website, which was our business name. And that gave us a platform to really change and touch a lot of people's lives. And I'm very proud of the work we did with that.
It's interesting, I'm just listening to you talk about how your personal experience sort of led you really naturally into the work that you've been doing. And I know you're interested now in an even broader spectrum of topics, although I think they were originally really part of the Whole 9 idea.
Yeah, totally. So, my focus on nutrition really was sort of happenstance in a way where the Whole 9 model at the time was really this sort of multifaceted, holistic, healthy living idea, of which nutrition was one of those 9 factors, of which the Whole30 was a short-term, temporary, introductory kind of thing. So it was just a really small thing that became a large focal point for the website and the work that we did, but really it always has been and still is a small part for me of this much, much larger way of living. And so now my interest is stepped beyond food as a focal point. Our first book was called It Starts With Food, and I still believe that to be the case. Like, that's the most impactful place you can start.
Yeah.
But then as we move beyond that and get into all of the other kind of really important and I think largely underaddressed parts of people's lives that make them healthier, we have to look at the way people engage with each other. We have to look at social connections and human relationships. And in this busy, technologically ridden world, those things sometimes fall by the wayside.
A lot. They fall by the wayside.
Right.
So for folks who are not familiar with your whole body of work, I would share the first book and the second book, last time I checked, were both on the New York Times bestseller list. True. Yeah. And clearly you've made this an incredible impact. It's kind of a meme of its own. Have you done a Whole30? Right. It's like, I'm sure you could Google it now. It'll be in the dictionary at some point. But the idea that you have now about moving beyond that program and into this space that's a little bit even more holistic, more nuanced. Obviously, the podcast is one of the ways that you're going to be doing this, but I'm sure there are others. But what are you excited to share right now? Why a podcast also, by the way, because that wouldn't necessarily be everybody's first choice.
Well, it wasn't my first choice either. Actually, people have been throwing the idea of a podcast at me for literally years. And I was like, no. Partly because I don't really like to just sit around and talk about myself by myself. So
you're doing a good job, though.
Well, it's actually really cool because you're here with me and we're having fun and but to do a podcast on my own didn't sound appealing to me at all. So the conversational piece is a lot better for me. But really, it's I enjoy teaching.
Yeah.
And so just that sort of verbal expression of ideas that I think are really important is easy for me and it's fun. I describe myself as an author, not a writer, where yes, I have 2 best-selling books that have been published, but writing is not my best, easiest method of communication. Yeah. And so being able to kind of speak both in podcast and conversational format, but also in sort of lecture format, which I've done a lot of, is really it's comfortable and easy and really a lot of fun for me.
It's neat too, because then you also get to hear back from people in a more easeful way about what that means and take questions and that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's good. Well,
so that's how I got here.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about me. Let's talk about you. You also have a really like unconventional and interesting childhood and kind of early life story. Tell me about your childhood.
There are some interesting parallels in our stories. I mean, the childhood is strikingly similar in that my mom really wanted to raise her kids in an environment like she was raised in. She was born and raised on mostly farmland in the Midwest in Minnesota, and then had gone off and gone to college and became a faculty wife and was going to raise her kids in Lake Forest, Illinois, where my dad was a college professor. And she suddenly realized that the values that were in Lake Forest, which is the leafy suburb you might remember from Risky Business and Ordinary People. It's an upper middle class, it's very upper class in spots, suburban environment. But she felt that it was discriminatory and it was money obsessed, and she wanted to raise her kids in a back to the land way. She was right, yeah. So I had an interesting world in that my mom decided to start this farm in 1970 with her best friend, who was a fellow faculty wife. And not long after, she and my dad started sort of growing apart. My dad was a very urban guy, an intellectual who was a college professor in sociology and anthropology, and was one of the guys kind of in the middle of the birth of the positive psychology movement and human development and human potential. So I had a world where I would be with my dad, and that was very academic and very much about books and ideas and lots of words.
Well, I can totally see your dad's influence in kind of what you do now and just sort of the way you view the world, the sociology, anthropology. Yeah. Like I can see that influence.
Yep, and it's both influence because my mom too had a huge impact on me. She had this idea that we could make the world the way we wanted it to be. We could make our own world that way. So she had a utopian fantasy of having this back to the land farm with her best friend where they would make their own clothes and grow their own food and build their own homes. And they actually did that. And for about 15 years, most of my early childhood was spent on this farm. And I learned doing that stuff. Yeah. And a lot of what I learned were similar to what you mentioned, natural rhythms, of darkness and light, where things come from. Where does our food come from? Where do building products come from? How do we live naturally in rhythms of work and play? You can't work all the time on a farm. You just get exhausted. It's too much. And I think that had a big impact. I feel like in some ways my dad's question was, why is the world the way it is? Let's look at our culture. Let's look at our society. Let's think about what the norms are. Let's look at patterns and societal rules. I wish I would have known your dad, because those are the kind of things I like to learn too. You would have loved my dad. You would have loved my dad. He passed away last year, and I still miss him every day. But that was his question. Why is the world the way it is? And my mom's question was, how could we make the world more the way we want it to be?
Sort of in a formative steering way.
Yes. Nice. And let's just create it to the extent we can in a mini way. So this pastoral existence that you and I share, I also had an outhouse growing up. We're probably the only two people in Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I don't really know anyone else who had that story. I say to people, like, we had no electricity, no running water, and they're like, you had what?
Yeah, but it really does make you appreciate a lot about some of the modern conveniences that we have, and the fact that they're conveniences, not absolute necessities, and the fact that some of them have begun to encroach on our way of life, and we're going to be obviously talking more about that. So that was my early childhood, and I went to a 3-room schoolhouse. I was a very bookish kid. I loved reading.
Are we actually the same person?
And strangely, we're so not. And yet, we have a lot in common. Totally. It's weird. But I loved, same thing. You could just put me with a book anywhere and I'd be happy. I was definitely not an athletic kid. I was an asthmatic kid. And I developed a kind of anxiety about athletic performance and competition. Didn't want any part of that world. They also didn't have any competitive sports really where I was. It was like maybe you play on the kickball team or something, dodgeball. And by the time I got to high school, I went to high school in the Twin Cities to an alternative public high school, again, kind of a weird place with different norms and different structures. And I was kind of at sea for a long time about what I was interested in. I always loved words, and I loved literature, and I loved reading. I loved the arts. But then I took a cell biology class in high school. It was really the first official science class I'd ever taken. Dallas, it blew my mind. I mean, I remember the first time I looked in a microscope and saw like a
stuff
cell
moving and things happening. Yeah.
and learned about all of this stuff that had just been completely invisible to me. Yet I'd been surrounded by it my whole life. I just didn't understand it at the micro level. I never became much of a great science student, but it gave me a great appreciation for what science is and was and does. But went to school for comparative literature in college.
And what is comparative literature? Forgive my ignorance.
It's a very good question. It's not an ignorant question. I didn't know what it was either until someone suggested I change my major to it. I was an English major, and then I started taking all these French classes, fell in love with French, and my advisor said, boy, you're racking up a lot of French credits. You might want to change your major. I lived in France for a year as an undergrad, and then decided to be a comp lit major. It's basically, interestingly, a lot of different subjects that you get to compare and contrast and integrate. So literature, language, history, philosophy, geography to some extent, and then a lot of theory and critical theory. So it's kind of an academic brainiac subject.
But it's a very broad view of the world.
Yes. Yeah. And that was one thing that I ended up really realizing. I'm interested in a lot of things like you. I like learning constantly and continuously. And I like to be able to follow my own curiosity wherever it goes. So when I got out of school, I thought I was going to be a college professor like my dad. And I got a Fulbright of all things to go and teach in France. And I thought, oh my God, this is it, the beginning of my academic career.
Here we go.
I got it made. Went to France, started teaching as an assistant in a college, they're called, like a junior high. And I realized I really didn't love teaching in the classroom.
Oh, interesting.
What I loved was sharing the things I was the most excited about with other people. So when I came home, I realized I was kind of like, I don't know, what do I do with a comparative literature degree? I really didn't want to go to grad school to be a professor anymore.
And not wanting to teach.
Yeah. And I fell into this strange series of dead-end jobs that were really more about me understanding that I was going to probably have to create my own career.
Good lessons to learn.
It was a good lesson.
Hard lessons to learn, I
Painful.
imagine.
A 10-year lesson, it turns out. Ultimately, I, like you in college, I sort of also had a health degradation occur. And after I moved away from the farm, really, I started accumulating the damage of living in a normal society, of eating processed foods and watching more television, getting into stress for the first time, really, in my college career.
Well, especially if you're changing jobs and, moving. And,
yes, absolutely. And little by little, I saw my health just decline and my happiness decline. And I was like, well, this isn't good. I was once healthy and happy. How do I get back to being healthy and happy? And yet, I didn't really want to move back at that point and live on this communal farm that I'd grown up on. And this became a really big obsession of mine for many years of like, how do I do this? How can I be healthy? Began reading all these health and fitness magazines. And I was just like, somehow the answer must be in these magazines.
So these are the like Shape and women's
Self.
Health and
I don't even think Women's Health existed back then. It was just the beginning of the health and fitness magazine era. So this was in the mid 90s probably. And lo and behold, I would read them and nothing would change. I wouldn't get healthier. I wouldn't get happier. And in
fact, would you do as you were told and nothing would change? Or like...
Yes, and I would follow the program. Like it's a 6-week program or a 6-day program. And inevitably, I would end up feeling worse by the second or third day. I'd begin with this very hopeful start. And then I would be hungry. I'd be miserable. I would try doing the workouts. I couldn't do them. I also didn't know what sets and reps were at that point. I was like, what do I do now?
And things didn't get better.
And I felt worse about myself. And I started realizing I was going to have to abandon that strategy, go back to what had worked for me, which was reading books and research papers and things that I'd learned in college. And ultimately started figuring it out for myself, combining some of the stuff that my mom had taught me about being healthy. Lo and behold, whole foods.
Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that. And being outside and understanding the natural rhythms of life. And part of it was just trial and error. I tried a lot of different stuff. But once I figured it out in my late 20s, early 30s, it occurred to me, why has no one actually done a magazine talking about how this works for real?
Like, why didn't you find the way to do that earlier?
Yeah. Why are these magazines so dumb? It was all about bikini bodies and, how to lose 10 pounds overnight and how to, seduce the man of my dreams, none of which was really what I was after, So ultimately, I decided that it would be fun to imagine a better sort of magazine. And I wrote up this idea for a progressive, healthy living magazine that, long story short, ended up getting green lighted by a company that wanted to invest in it. And I've been doing that for 15 years. And in fact, I'm just closing up my work on it now after 15 years and moving along to something else.
So you've run the magazine for 15 years.
Yeah. It started in 2001, Experience Life magazine. It's published by Lifetime.
It's a great magazine.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm really proud of it. But after about 10 years of doing that, I also recognized that there was another part of the story that I really wanted to talk about, which was I had dabbled in, but I hadn't really vocalized very clearly, which is that the health of an individual depends on the health of the society and the context in which they live, family, community, the planet, really. And that led me to a project I call Revolutionary Act, which I launched in 2010, I think. And that was under this idea that being healthy in an unhealthy culture is a revolutionary act.
No doubt.
Is a revolutionary act, which I know you actually have articulated a lot of these same ideas in a separate path.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I knew of the Revolutionary Acts, kind of series, that kind of information long before I knew of you and your work, and because it was such an awesome, refreshing idea, and I really, really liked that. And so knowing now, like sort of in hindsight or whatever, like that came out of your brain totally makes sense to me, knowing your view on the world and kind of remembering my impression of the Revolutionary Act series. I'm like, oh, this all makes total sense. And it really resonated with me from like a values and worldview perspective so much. So here we are.
Yeah, exactly. Here we are. And I think now, everything that I've learned up until this point has convinced me that speaking your own truth about what you know in this field of health and happiness and reality is valuable. Like, we need lots of voices. There's lots of different versions of the truth.
Yeah.
But I think you and I have shared so many of the same basic principles about what creates health and what degrades it. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm the most excited to work on the podcast with you. And by the way, I should mention that this came out of a kind of sidewinder email you sent me one day that was just like, hey, would you ever want to do a podcast? ? And I'm like, yes, I would.
Well, but that's how, like, actually, all, like, at least in my experience, how all the, like, funnest and awesomest projects always happen. They're like one of these, like, someone, like, slings you an idea, or you, like, wake up one day and you're like, what would happen if, or someone will ask me, like, are you going to do a podcast? I'm like, no, but I should.
Good idea.
Like, thanks for someone else, thanks for someone else's idea.
I love that. Well, and so I want to just, I think in closing, we should just let's tell folks what why would you invest this much of your time and energy in something? This is a big project for both of us.
It is a big project, for sure. For me, at least, it's a way to allow sort of an open-ended conversation, both to learn from you and to have dialogue throughout upcoming podcast episodes, but really just to say, here's a way, one option, because there isn't one correct way of doing things, but here's an option that can sort of empower people to make positive change in their own lives in a sort of accessible, reasonable way, because I know it's been tremendously impactful in my own life. And so the things that we'll talk about have been things that have made my life better over many, many years, and will continue to make things better in the coming years as I continue to experiment and try new things. Because that's really how you learn about all this stuff, is through that sort of ongoing personalized experimentation.
Yeah, I echo that. I think the other part, in addition to that, for me, is the chance to continue to explore with people in real life situations and hear back from people. I think it's always really great to test your theories. And many of the studies that you and I both would love to see done in the realm of nutrition, for example, and lifestyle, are not easy studies to do.
Or they're actually impossible studies to do, where you'd have to control, like somebody from like their entire life. And they just can't be done. So we're going to take little chunks of that and pull them out and impose upon people our suggestions as far as what experiments they can do.
Here's what we think you might want to try next.
But as we're doing that kind of along the way ourselves, I think it'll be fun. I think we'll learn a lot.
So we're hoping everyone will tune in with us as we're learning and growing and sharing more of what we know. And folks can find out more about the podcast at livingexperiment.com. And what else do we need to tell people?
We're also on social media. We're on Twitter. And we are...
Instagram, I believe.
Instagram. And we'll have a Facebook page. And we'll have all sorts of different ways. And all of that will be available on the website. So connect with us. We're going to have a lot of fun.
And tell us what you want to hear about. Where are you struggling? What are you interested in? What are the conundrums that you're facing on a daily basis? We'll take them all on week by week, episode by episode.
Absolutely. Welcome.